And welcome everyone to another episode of the Mind Sculptors podcast. I am your host Callahan, and today we will be answering the never-ending question, is Dominaria United the set that breaks cEDH? Joining me today to help me answer this question are my two trusty cEDH veterans, Cobblepott and Pongo. Before we dive into our discussion over some of the new cards, I want to thank our patrons for all the support you give. Your support goes towards continuing the show and improving it, being able to put this out every week. So if you like the show and you want to join the Sculpty family, please head on over to patreon.com/TheMindSculptors. You can find out more information there. With that said, let's go ahead and jump into my conversation with Pongo and Cobblepott. Dear Sculptybois, where do you think the meta would be if Paradox Engine and or Flash were still legal? All right, Cobble, so give us your sage wisdom.
Those are two very, very different cards. Paradox Engine, what it enabled was a lot of lower quality decks like Arkham and original Sisay, some of the mono red commanders of old, those styles of decks to have a fighting chance if they were able to get Paradox into the battlefield. Flash is something that's on, the complete other end of the spectrum. So today, if Flash was legal, everybody would run Grafdigger's Cage and or Rest in Peace. Underworld Breach would be less effective because people would be playing more Graveyard Hate to counter the threat of Flash.
If Flash was around, Winota would not be half as effective for the reason that people would be incidentally playing Grafdigger's Cage. Mm-hmm. And if you're playing Winota, you hate to see Grafdigger's Cage because the second that comes down, you don't have tutors in your deck to find the answers for it. So I do think that, again, if Flash is in the picture, things look very different. But there's this very, very toxic disruption to the sort of natural rock, paper, scissors metagame that makes for more compelling games of cEDH.
And right, you would see Wheels again.
Yeah.
Wheels would come back because Wheels were used. So because Hulk requires you to sculpt a hand, you need to have Flash and Hulk and protection in your hand to be able to go off consistently. Especially with Thrasios and Tymna, people would slowly sculpt their hands, and then somebody would cast Fortune, and all of the Hulk decks that weren't able to interact with that would find themselves in a world of hurt.
Man, it's good to see both of you. It's been a while since we've really recorded anything. Yeah. All three of us.
The dream team.
And we're going to do the set review. A little bit of a disclaimer. This set has a lot of cards that are very good in very specific decks. Mm-hmm. So there are probably going to be some cards on that we aren't going to talk about that you're excited about. And that does not mean it's not a good card or that it's not exciting for that archetype. It just means that we can't record. I have to figure out how to make this all fit in an hour. And so
we're going to talk about cards that aren't good as well. But,
but that's
so don't worry.
Interesting.
Callahan says, I want to talk about this one. So sometimes those cards also slip through the cracks.
Oh my god. So the first card on our list is Temporary Lockdown. It is a white enchantment that costs a colorless into white. And it says, when Temporary Lockdown enters the battlefield, exile each non-land permanent with mana value 2 or less until temporary lockdown leaves the battlefield. And Cobblepott, you're already doing some Xur stuff that we'll talk about later. But let's talk about the Xur of olden times. And we've talked a lot on this show about stacks Xur and the viability of that. And I've started to kind of see that crop up in places. What are your thoughts on temporary lockdown? Is this probably a place where Xur might find it? Will other decks be interested in it? What's kind of your take, Gobble?
I don't feel like it's really going to see play, but it's interesting to at least talk about because it has elements of cards that do see play and elements of cards that don't. So this is one of those exile until kind of effects rather than destroy or just exile altogether. It has similarities to Grasp of Fate, but it's symmetric instead of asymmetric, and it hits everything. And it only hits things that are 2 CMC or less, rather than Out of Time, which hits all the creatures for a certain period of time. So depending on what you're trying to do, if the things that you care about are safely above that 2 CMC threshold, then this is, it's an interesting choice, especially because it's exile until. And if you have a means of blinking it back and forth, it's, similar to Abdel, where if you've got a number of rocks that are less than 2, basically all the rocks that see play are 2 CMC and less, blink them, activate. If you have a means of blinking an enchantment, there's a lot of ways to convert that into going, mana positive. It's flexible. The asymmetry of it all is part of what gives it that flexibility, because you can use it, to enable lines for yourself, or you can use it to disable lines, exiling everybody else's dorks and their fast mana. All of that said, is this going to overtake Out of Time or Grasp of Fate? I don't think so. I don't see this as being immediately better than either one of those two. And those two don't really see any play. I mean, they say limited play.
Very niche.
Right. It's interesting to look at the differences between those kinds of cards and see what kinds of avenues they open up. But at the end of the day, it's probably not compelling to actually see play.
The next card on our list is... Wait, I thought this card was banned in EDH.
Hashtag free Braids.
This is Braids. No, not that one. Braids Arisen Nightmare. It is a 3/3 legendary creature nightmare. Wow, that's a lot of nightmare in the same card name. It costs a colorless and 2 black. And the card says, at the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice an artifact, creature, enchantment, land, or planeswalker. If you do, each opponent may sacrifice a permanent that shares a card type with it. For each opponent who doesn't, that player loses 2 life and you draw a card. So Pongo, there is a very important word that keeps coming up in this card. And it's the word may.
Nightmare, right?
Yes. No, excuse me. It's nightmare. The word may comes up twice in this card. And how much do you think that changes how good or bad this card is? Like, what's your read on it?
Well, May is my birth month, so that really improves the card in my estimation.
Automatic, 10 out of 10. Let's go.
No, but I think that certainly that helps a lot in the sense that you're not required. And then obviously the other May would normally be like a downside, except that here it's kind of doing some heavy lifting. So this doesn't fall into like the standard Punisher trap where like your opponents will kind of always pick the one that's best for them. Yes, they will, right? But in many situations, you can engineer that so that no choice is particularly good for them, with some exceptions. The biggest issue with this card is that I find it's quite poor from behind. If you're at parity or ahead, then this card is quite good. And importantly, it's good at parity. Otherwise, I think I would not really be all that interested in talking about it. So why is this card good? I know Phoenix, for example, has been testing this out in Najeela. And in Najeela, the main resource that you will be able to get ahead on is going to be creatures, naturally, because of the token generation capability. So if you can sacrifice a token to this ability into a piece of removal for a mana dork, like one card draw, and then like a piece of removal for, even like an Ornithopter out of like a Winota deck. Like that's pretty decent, right? Because you at least drew a card and you also took out a mana dork, and like, okay, maybe you feel bad you didn't hit the Ornithopter, but like I engineered, I think, a pretty poor situation for this card. I think more often than not, people are going to have more valuable creatures. So either you're taking a more valuable creature, or else you're just drawing upwards of 3 cards for the price of like one creature. And that's pretty good. You're happy, I think, with any of those outcomes.
It's interesting. The ability of the May trigger really makes this card so that if you are behind, doesn't put you more behind, if that makes sense.
But then it does
nothing. Yeah, it does nothing. But like at minimum, it's kind of that like it doesn't screw you over. Right. But Cobble, I know you were talking about this specifically within Kenrith stacks. So, I mean, kind of give us your take on it in Kenrith.
So one of the aspects of Kenrith that is profitable is that you can activate Kenrith to reanimate creatures, and you might have other things that can recur things out of the graveyard. So on the one hand, you can expend resources that you have an abundance of, or you can, expend a resource that you have unlimited supply, but then just get it back by paying some mana, which makes it, a lot easier to sustain in the long run. You don't have to be way ahead on creatures as long as you can at least keep on getting the creature that you're sacrificing back each turn.
Right.
The thing about this card that makes it compelling is that you select the type each turn. If it was like always sacrifice a creature, or you sacrifice an artifact or whatever, then the floor would be pretty bad, because you're not really able to be tactical in what kind of forces you're exerting.
You might not even have that material all the time. Right. The fact that this is a creature and that the things you sacrifice are potentially able to be recurred through activated abilities rather than spellcasts, it lends itself to Rule of Law shells particularly well.
On to our next card. This is Ertai the Resurrected, which is 2 colorless and a blue-black legendary creature that is a 3/2 Phyrexian human wizard. And it has flash, and when Ertai Resurrected enters the battlefield, choose up to 1. You can either 1, counter target spell, activated ability, or triggered ability. Its controller draws a card. Or the other is destroy another target creature or planeswalker. Its controller draws a card. This is a very interesting card. So first of all, Pongo, obviously, there's some very obvious comparisons to be made with another legendary flash card, which is Venser. But this does have some different pieces to that. So kind of, what is your kind of take on this card? What do you think it's better? Do you think it's worse? Where do you feel on this?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if it's like strictly an upgrade or if it's a side grade. I'm leaning a little bit towards a slight upgrade over Venser in certain contexts. Basically, the main text that distinguishes the two is the fact that this can hit activated and triggered abilities, where the only way Venser can actually interact with those would be to prevent the card from hitting play in the first place. In addition to that, like there's real upside to like letting a thing resolve, or, you know, like passing priority on it until it resolves and then countering the ability, because you can glean information. Anyway, I don't want to get too much into that. But, you know, essentially compared to Venser, this card is making people spend their cards a lot more, whereas Venser is just tempoing people, right? It's kind of basically saying you need to spend mana for that effect. The fact that this makes people draw cards is notable downside. One of the use cases of Venser is to create like hard locks with Venser. And this drawing people into cards can be very awkward if that's your plan. So it's not a one-to-one swap in that respect. So it's interesting, you know, it's a bit of this, bit of that. It's intriguing though. And certainly I could see it being played. And naturally, you can turn that downside of your opponent's drawing cards into upside. For instance, if you're fighting against the Thassa's Oracle type effects, which allows you to make people draw cards and lose in response to their triggers. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I just think at 4 mana, probably it's not going to see a ton of play.
You had talked about it in the context of any Rule of Law deck, Cobble, where you're able to flicker it and kind of break parity on it to some extent. Go into more detail on that for us. Tell us a little bit more about what your thoughts are there.
Okay, so Rule of Law, you want to capitalize on as many means of having meaningful game actions that don't require you to cast anything. So if you have a way of blinking or recurring permanents that cause an effect on entering the battlefield, then you're able to preserve or, you know, get the most out of your one spell per turn. For instance, if you have a way to either blink Ertai with Displacer Kitten or MEL, or with a activation of Kenrith's Reanimation, then one, there's no spell cast at all, so it's much more difficult to deal with, the same way that the same problems that are presented with Oracle, where people generally aren't running stifle effects, so their ability to interact is generally pretty limited. This can hit triggered abilities, activated abilities, spells, permanents. It's very, very flexible. 4 mana is a lot, yeah, but Rule of Law decks, you know, stacks decks in general, are looking to exploit the value from individual cards rather than the economy of stringing together many efficient cards. So 4 mana is, stacks decks play 6 mana cards if the effect is strong enough. So I think that it's well within the realm of possibility in Kenrith. I'm going to be testing it there, just because I'm already running some effects that allow me to recur and blink different permanents, and we will see if it actually delivers on any of this conjecture that we have about it.
Next card on our list is Meria, Scholar of Antiquity. She is a legendary creature that is an elf artificer, and that is a 3/3 that costs 1 colorless, a red, and a green. It's 2 activated abilities. One says tap an untapped non-token artifact you control, add green mana. I know that you don't say green mana to your mana pool anymore. It's just embedded in my vocabulary. Second ability is tap 2 untapped non-token artifacts you control, exile the top card of your library. You may play it this turn. So there's two things here right away. First of all, as a fan of Arden decks, I'm just going to get this out of the way. I am making happy Arden noises right now. That that is a great card in Ardentana. But other people are looking at this as a Gruul commander and as specifically a stacks Gruul commander. So when we're looking at this Pongo, there are some immediate similarities to another card that is played in a stacksy way, and that's Urza, believe it or not. And so people have been calling this Gruul Urza. So take us through kind of this card and where you think it's going to land.
I mean, it's 2-color Urza, right? And more colors equals more better. So this is just better Urza. Is there any flaws with my logic?
Checks out.
Well, it does have blue.
Sounds good to me.
No. Don't examine it too closely. So yeah. I mean, obviously this is similar to Urza, and actually the text on this card is powerful. It's very powerful. Yes. I think that this card is quite good. But obviously this game plan in red-green is, I think, less good than it would be than it is in blue. Getting red is nice though, but that's for sure. But that's offset to a large extent by the fact that the ability says non-token artifacts, and I understand why they did it. I understand why they did it because red green are the color of treasures now. But it's really sad that they did it because this card, I think, goes from being extremely compelling and one I'm really excited about in a lot of different places, to one that, becomes a bit more niche, a bit more of a niche player. As a commander, however, I think this pair of abilities is quite good. I really like being able to obviously just use my artifacts, like even under collector roof type effects, which I would be playing in green. And so I'm able to do that here. Naturally, you can turn off your Winter Orb, your Static Orb, and your Trinisphere type effects as you would be doing, for example, in like an Urza Shell. So you get those same lines, those same angles. And I think that, those are reasonable angles. You lose out on artifact tutors. Like red is actually not as good at tutoring artifacts as it's easy to believe. Right. If you want to tutor goblins, red is your color, it turns out. So I think that that's a major downside for that game plan specifically. And because of the inability to tutor those effects, I do have to wonder whether or not this deck will be able to consistently enough assemble that plan.
So here's my question, because we look at the red-green commanders on the database. We have Rurikthar, which costs 6 mana. We have Gruul Snoop, which is Gallia of the Endless Dance, which doesn't really do anything. And then we have Daryl, Hunter of Walkers, which is
pretty unique, and
it is very unique. Yeah. So, and we notably saw in the MLC draft, it was the only color combo that didn't have any decks drafted from it. So, with that being said, if you were to sit down, Cobble, next season, and 4th round, it's getting late, some of your favorites are gone, is this something you would consider? I guess my question is do you think this is now, we are looking at a Gruul commander that is probably more compelling than most?
Yeah. Gruul has deficiencies compared to the other colors when it comes to the ability to tutor things, but it's real good at tutoring creatures. And this doesn't say non-creature, non-token artifacts. So there's a number of artifact-oriented stacks creatures that are easily found within the Gruul color spectrum. Is that enough to make it contend with Urza? No.
And they're not things you want to tutor for either.
Right. So it's one of those things where I can see this being a deck that kind of has what it needs at its core. So like a stacks deck really needs a way to generate mana and a way to draw cards, and stacks pieces to play. And really, this has the mana generation and card draw. All you need is just to have viable stacks pieces to throw into the battlefield. So the essential ingredients are there. It's just, does the color spectrum rule actually give you something that's compelling enough to be able to contend?
It's time for your favorite game show. Is this a Najeela card? On this week's episode, our contestant is one Pongo from Montreal. Yes, Mr. Pongo, we have here a Shauna Purifying Blade. Costs green, white, and blue, is a legendary human warrior that is a 3/3 with lifelink and says, at the beginning of your end step, you may pay X. If you do, draw X cards. X can't be greater than the amount of life you gained this turn. So, are you ready to play? Is this a Najeela card?
I mean, it's a warrior, right? So
yeah, it's a warrior, right?
It's a Najeela card. No, unfortunately.
So is this an on fire garbage can, or is this a Najeela card?
This one, I think fits more into the garbage can. The biggest issues with this card, obviously, being the awkward casting cost, but more importantly, the fact that you have to pay mana to draw the cards. That's really unfortunate. When like cards like Archivist of Ogma draw me like 3 cards in a turn cycle for 2 mana and like no additional mana investment like ever again for the rest of the game. So no, Callahan, to answer your question, this is not a Najeela card, and you should feel bad for even asking.
Congratulations, you answered correctly. You win Death by Siege Rhino. Some point in the future, Callahan is going to win a game of Magic the Gathering in cEDH with Siege Rhino against you. Thank you for playing. Is this a Najeela card? Next card on the list, which is Stenn, Paranoid Partisan. Stenn costs white and blue. Yes, indeed. This is a Lavinia card. It is a legendary human wizard that is a 2/2 and says, as Stenn, Paranoid Partisan enters the battlefield, choose a card type other than creature or land. Spells you cast of the chosen type cost 1 less to cast. It also has a second ability, which is a colorless, a white and a blue to activate, and you exile Stenn, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So, Cobblepott, I had said pre-show that this is dumb for a lot of reasons. Most notably, that in decks that are doing like the top combo, this is just a less narrow, like top reducer, because you're able to change the mode and use it in various ways of what you need it for in that situation, right? Like, what do you see this card? Is it a 99 card? Could it be its own commander? What do you think?
I could see either case. I'm not as high on it as the two of you are. There's a number of cost reducers that already exist in the format, several at 2 mana, and they do have impact for sure, especially for allowing top combos to go infinite. The ability to have this guy kind of exist all the time is, I think, it's a powerful effect, but it costs 3 mana every time you want to use it, and it isn't a blink,
right?
That is a fast blink. It's a end of turn blink. So if this was, I want to have him be, say, artifacts are going to cost me 1 less. Now I'm going to dump a whole bunch of artifacts onto the battlefield, blink him, and then say, now I want instants to cost 1 less, and then make use of all that mana. You can't do those lines because his blink isn't instantaneous,
right? And
that's like a main strategy that I would wish that you could take him, but I know that Pongo has some stronger feelings.
Yeah, Pongo.
You should take the reins on
this. This bad boy blocks for days. It is able to block, activate, get rid of all those Najeelas. What are you doing? We don't want none of that around here. Just
saying, he's literally pondering the orb. Like how how could you say anything bad about this card?
Well, he was a sleeper agent in the story. Spoiler alert.
Jokes aside, I think that this card actually does a lot that blue-white really, really wants, which is why it's such an exciting card. Outside of blue-white, perhaps it's less exciting. But blue-white is frequently leaning on like the top / future sight type combos, and obviously this can fill a role in there. Additionally, it can play a similar role to Baral early on, where it's going to be discounting your interactive spells, your card advantage spells, to allow you to sort of bridge into the later game, which are things that blue-white tends to need to do because it's not the fastest color combination. So something that is...
I don't know what you're talking about. I have a turn 1 Lavinia every single time.
Yeah, and how many times do you win the game?
That's not the issue.
Yeah, so I mean, that's the thing. Blue-white is reasonable at setting up a roadblock early on, as Callahan alluded to. Where it struggles is exactly as I was saying, in sort of bridging the mid game into the later game, where it's comparatively slower combos will start coming online. Not necessarily slower in the sense that they're like worse or they cost more mana. I mean, oftentimes they do, but slower in the sense that you're not going to have consistent access to them all the time. So frequently, because you can't easily tutor all those pieces with the same consistency as you would in a deck featuring black, you have to rely on draw engines to sort of find you these pieces in a longer game. And so, Stenn is interesting in the sense that he is both a combo piece, but also he's acceleration. He can generate multiple mana a turn if you're planning on playing multiple interactive or value generating instants, if that's what you put him on. And then what's really great is that you can do that early and not be stuck on that. So you can still use him as a combo piece later by flickering him. So that flicker ability is actually incredibly relevant.
Yeah.
And also you can use him to block and then flicker him and keep him around. Which is,
it also can avoid like mass removal too, which is really like if somebody wipes. Talks it like deluges or whatever, like you just activate that and it comes back at the end of turn and it's fine. Like it's wild.
Yeah. So I mean, 3 mana is a good amount to be holding up to do that, but obviously you're playing blue white, so in many
probably
situations
holding up mana
you're
anyway.
Playing a reactive game plan exactly. So I think that this card is really cool. Its biggest failing, if you want to call it that, is that will it see play in non-blue white decks? That's hard to say. But it could.
Yeah.
It could, right? It's still like a Helm of Awakening type effect, an asymmetrical one. And Helm of Awakening has historically seen play in like Stormir style of decks. Obviously, like it's not as good because it's not like discounting your Adnaz and then the rocks off of the Adnaz, right? It's kind of one or the other. So I'm not convinced that it will, revive that role. But again, counterpoint once again is it's a 2/2 body, and that's relevant for Tymna. So maybe it finds a home in some kind of more proactive, Esper or even 4-color shell. Who knows? I'm not putting money on it, but I do think it's a good get for blue white.
Yeah, blue white and Jeskai are gonna love this card.
Right.
Like this is new staple in those colors. Like Arden Crom obviously wants to be playing this. It does a lot of really good things with that already, but also you add the other layer of, you're playing the reality chip already in Arden Crom. So if you need to move onto that line, it allows you that ability to have it be a cost reducer for your interaction spells, all those things. But it also allows you to make do your combo or maybe put your Sword of Fire and Ice down faster, right? Like it has a lot of really cool potential that I'm excited about. I do think it's hilarious that they had to specify you could not say land as a card type.
I would totally pick land.
Yeah. Feels bad.
Lands cost 1 less to cast. Next card on our list is Vohar, Vodalian Desecrator. It is a blue-black Phyrexian Merfolk Wizard, legendary Merfolk Wizard. That is a 1/2. And it has a tap ability that says draw a card, then discard a card. If you discarded an instant or sorcery this way, each opponent loses 1 life, and you gain 1 life. And then it has a second activated ability that costs 2 colorless. Sacrifice Vohar, Vodalian Desecrator. You may cast target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard this turn. If that spell would be put into your graveyard, exile it instead. Activate only as a sorcery. So, Pongo, this is blue-black Scepter Commander. What is it? 1,209? Like,
at least, right?
Right? Like, how many blue-black Scepter Commanders have we gotten at this point? Right? Like,
this might be like the best one, though. Like, yeah. we might finally have gotten there. So, I mean, the biggest issue that I see for Scepter specifically is there's like some small risk that you have not cast Vohar before you've gotten the Scepter combo online, and then you might be hurt by summoning sickness in that position if your plan was to loot through your entire deck. It's really not hard to have your 2-drop commander before you assemble your combo. But there are situations, for example, if like there's a Drannith Magistrate in play, where maybe you weren't able to get it down first, and so that could be awkward. So it's not outside of the realm of possibility. What's really nice about Vohar, though, is that not only is it a perfectly cromulent Scepter outlet, that also kind of just does a thing for 2 mana that's actually pretty nice in these colors, which is just looting. It's also a 1-card win condition with like Tainted Pact type effects, because it turns out the card has a second ability, which is just sacrificing him,
a dumb ability,
and getting basically the Kess effect. So,
but not only that, I think you're underselling that second ability, because you can literally entomb a Peer into the Abyss and cast it for 2 mana.
No,
right?
You do have to pay the mana.
Oh, it doesn't. You have to pay the mana.
Yeah.
Never mind. I lied.
It would be very gross if you didn't. But
I saw that as that way, and I was like, "Holy crap!"
No, it's more like a regrowth type effect.
Okay.
or like a Flood of Recollection type effect.
Okay.
So no, it's not quite that absurd. So certainly this does really, really relevant things for blue-black. But like I always ask every time I see another one of these blue-black commanders is, sure, this is great for blue-black, but why am I not adding more colors to my blue-black deck? Vohar is interesting in the sense that it's cheap, which I think is fairly compelling reason. And then obviously offers some looting for a card selection, which is super relevant as well. But like, that second ability is similar enough to Kessa's ability. So is the cheaper mana cost and the looting and the Scepter outlet enough to offset losing red cards? I'm not convinced still. I'm still not convinced that we're quite there with blue-black commanders.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. Cobble, we were talking about it, and I was telling you beforehand, I've seen a lot of people that are Toxtrol pilots that are saying, all right, well, we're just going to change the commander to this and put Toxtrol in the 99 because it's easier to cast from the 99. Right. It's easier to get it on the battlefield reliably. So has this just kind of supplanted itself now as the best blue-black commander? Or Scepter commander?
I think so. It costs 2 mana, and it with Scepter doesn't need any other cards besides itself to win.
Right.
And it has a loot ability, so it can go Reanimator if you want to go in that direction. Like Pongo said, I mean, I wish that second ability wasn't constrained to being a sorcery.
Yeah.
Right.
I wish you could just kind of pop that off and then be able to use a spell. I understand why they constrained it, but that does make things awkward if you cast a Tainted Pact for your Oracle and then sacrifice your Vohar and cast the Oracle and then cast the Tainted Pact only to get disrupted and then you're in a difficult spot. But yeah, I think that this is for the cost and for the utility. This is, I think, a great blue-black versus Scepter.
Next card on our list. This is a card that Cobble has talked about quite a bit on Twitter. And I definitely on purpose sequenced the way I asked you these cards so that it landed here. This is Zur, Eternal Schemer. This is a new Zur. So again, like Braids, it's Zur. No, not that one. And it costs a white, a blue, and a black. It's a human wizard that has flying. It's a 1/4 as well. And it says enchantment creatures you control have Death Touch, Lifelink, and Hexproof. And that has an activate ability that it costs 1 colorless and a white. Target non-aura enchantment you control becomes a creature in addition to its other types and has base power and toughness, each equal to its mana value. So there's an interesting word in that, an interesting type or ability that Zur gives these enchantment creatures, and that is hexproof, which is nutty. And you were talking in the pre-show, we were talking about this card, and you pointed out this is a persistent effect. This is not an until end of turn effect.
Right. There is no phrase that specifies until end of turn. So when you target one of your enchantments and to turn it into a creature and give it hexproof so that somebody can't remove it, it is a creature with Death Touch, Lifelink, and hexproof for the remainder of its lifetime game. So this is a very powerful effect, especially since it doesn't require a tap or anything. So you can execute it multiple times per turn, and it allows you to do some really, really gross looping things, and it's I think perhaps a design mistake.
Design mistake. Ooh.
Yeah. So the list that I'm doing is stacks, obviously. So you play your stacks pieces and turn them into creatures. And the fact that they've got Death Touch, Lifelink, and Hexproof makes them very much more difficult to remove, but also makes them much more threatening as far as a clock is concerned.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that stacks decks have to kind of balance and reconcile is closing the game out, and that's not always straightforward. For you see a lot of the win-con-less stacks decks that are out there, notably Rule of Law, because Oracle console is not easy to execute through that.
Not going anywhere.
Right. This is, I mean, it's just, it's very, very strong just on the face that it presents a clock and allows you to continue to, keep your life level high and protect your stacks pieces. But also, it turns them into creatures. So then you can do things that you normally only do for creatures, like copying them, clone effects, and so on. Normally don't see a whole lot of play for non-creature types. So if you wanted to make a copy or multiple copies of, for instance, Smothering Tithe, then that's a circumstance where you've got, let's say you've got just 2 copies of Smothering Tithe. That is 2 4/4s with Death Touch, Lifelink, and Hexproof that are generating a ton of treasure. And
yes, please. Yes.
This is fine. Everything's fine.
I mean, oppression, people discard a card whenever you cast a spell. I mean, if you have multiples of those on the battlefield and they come and swing at you and attack you too, and you can't remove them, those are quite compelling. There's just a lot of powerful stacks pieces that become really, really broken under this shell. And I've only been looking into it for a day or so, and have found all kinds of stuff that's really, really interesting.
Are there any enchantments, like non-aura enchantments, right, that have an activated ability that lets you deal a damage somewhat to a creature? Because if so, the Death Touch ability on that is kind of nuts. I'm sure that does exist. I just don't want to Google anything.
I think they're all in red. I mean, the ones that are coming to mind are all in red.
Yeah, like Gearper, Aether Grid, and stuff like that. Yeah,
it's a very red
now,
effect.
This does have Parallax Wave.
You were telling us about this earlier. This is wild.
It's a 4-mana enchantment that has fading. So when it comes into play, it has 5 fading counters. You can remove counter to exile a creature until this permanent leaves the battlefield. So you can remove those counters anytime. They're not constrained by a sorcery clause. So if somebody tries to do something to your board state, notwithstanding the fact that you've got hexproof for presumably most of your creatures, you can exile up to 4 of those creatures and then have it exile itself, which will then cause all of them to come back into play. It's reset back up to 5 counters again, and you need to pay another 2 mana to turn it back into a creature. But it's just very, very difficult. It's very near intractable to actually remove in any sort of permanent way. So it's extremely resilient, which is what you want in a stacks deck. So I'm pretty happy with it. This is the first time I've played Bident of Thassa in like 6 years. So because that's an artifact and an enchantment.
Right.
So attacking someone with Bident of Thassa, it's great.
Next card on our list is Plaza of Heroes. This is a land that taps for a colorless. It also taps, add 1 mana of any color. Spend this mana only to cast a legendary spell. Also says tap to add 1 mana of any color among legendary permanents you control. And then it has a 4th ability. Yes, there is a lot of text on this card. That costs 3 colorless mana. You tap, exile it. Target legendary creature gains hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. And this came up in a game recently, Pongo, of ours on stream, where one of our opponents used it on my Crom so that you couldn't win the game. It has some strengths, but Cobble, I think when I'm looking at this card, right, I automatically see it, and there's some obvious like downsides to it, right? Like it kind of has that Mox Amber downside, where you can only make whatever legendary permanent you control is. But as a card in mana bases of maybe 4 colors and down the line, like where do you see this card as far as that goes?
So it depends. I think it's best for partners and for cheap commanders that care about having their commander on the battlefield. It does have the Mox Amber problem, but it compensates much better than Mox Amber does. Yeah. So for one, in the worst case, it gives you colorless. So it's never a land that does nothing. Right. It's not a Gaia's Cradle with no creatures on the battlefield. But differently from Mox Amber, you can use it to cast legendary spells, namely your commander. So it does appropriate color fixing for Thrasios or Timna or Malcolm or whoever, low cost, Najeela commander you're trying to get onto the battlefield. If you're playing Inala or, a commander that isn't really something that you're trying to get onto the battlefield early or ever, then this loses a lot because it's just going to be colorless for most cases, unless you happen to be playing a stacks deck that is heavily into, legendary creatures where, there's a lot of legendary creatures that happen to be good stacks creatures, or, you maybe play it in mono white because Charles will find some way of breaking it in half in that circumstance. But that's a joke because you don't need it in mono white because you don't need color fixing.
So you had mentioned Najeela, and I had Pongo, Phoenix, and I have talked about this. And Pongo, what you've said, and I think I agree with you on this, is in Najeela, it's just a mountain most of the time, right?
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I really wish it looked at color identity and not just the color pips in the cards. Because unfortunately it's just a mountain most of the time. Up until you have to Revi already in play. Sure, then it's a 4-color land. If you have, maybe the one other legendary permanent we play, like Chatterfang, then sure, okay. It can tap for a green at that point too. but like it's just not that many legendary permanents. So most of the time it is only tapping for red, which is a bit unfortunate because in that deck you really, not only is red mana not that valuable, you usually want your lands to be tapping for multiple colors.
Well, that about wraps things up for us here on this week's episode of the Mind Sculptors. Thank you so much for tuning in. We covered a ton of cards in our set review, but not all of them made it into the episode. If you want to see all of the outtakes, listen to all of that. Unfortunately, the video got corrupted, but we do have the audio. So if you want to hear the entire 3 hours of us talking about the set, one of the patron perks is access to the uncut footage of our recording sessions. So if you want access to that, you can head on over to patreon.com/the Mind Sculptors or check out the link in the description. I also want to thank our top tier patrons, Justin, Adam Hamden, David Snavely, Dionysius, Jason Bialik, Matt Boehner, and Senior Coupon. Thank you to everybody who supports us, and thank you again for joining us. And from all of us here at the Mind Sculptors, I'm Callahan, and we'll see you next time.